There will be no escapes from this camp.
It was the incredible story of captured airmen that no prison could hold.
A lot of the chaps were really escape crazy. They lived and dreamed escaping.
How many are you taking out?
250.
250?
It was a film that celebrated the unbelievable exploits of real-life heroes.
We were proud of what we did. We were just darn sorry that 50 were murdered as a result of it.
But when The Great Escape rode the crest of critical acclaim in 1963, few knew how the facts had been changed to ensure box office success. And just how many detours from the truth had been taken to meet the demands of Hollywood and its stars. In 1963, the film The Great Escape brought to life a daring and ingenious plan to liberate more than 200 men from Stalag Luft 3, the most secure prisoner of war camp in the heart of Hitler's Germany.
This time we'll dig straight down 30 feet before we go horizontal. That'll rule out any question of sound detection or probing.
All right, Roger, but did you say the first tunnel?
I did. There'll be 3. If the goons find one, we'll move into the other.
How many men do you plan to take out, Roger?
250.
It's impossible to make a place escape-proof, believe me, especially if you got anybody with any brains. And if you've got 2,000 guys with brains all thinking the same thing, there's no way they can keep you in.
One of the real-life prisoners was Australian pilot Paul Brickhill, who had been shot down by the Germans in Tunisia in 1943 and brought to Germany, where he was held in Stalag Luft 3 until 1945. While in captivity, Brickhill was involved in the construction of 3 tunnels, including the 350-foot underground passage through which 76 men escaped in March 1944.
Paul Brickhill was sort of the official historian of the escape organization. He was allowed access to all of the workshops, everything that was going on, because I think the escape leaders realized that this was a big operation and that they wanted the story to be told at some point.
In 1950, Brickhill published a memoir of his wartime experiences, which immediately caught the attention of Hollywood director John Sturges, who had produced documentaries for the Army Air Corps during World War II. After the war, Sturges earned a reputation for directing ensemble casts in predominantly male stories, such as Bad Day at Black Rock. Sturges wanted to turn Brickhill's book, The Great Escape, into a film.
John thought it would make a great motion picture. But he was convinced that it was about, really about nobility and honor.
Brickhill turned down many film offers for his book because he didn't want to exploit the story. But Sturges continued to pursue Brickhill.
John was a true bulldog. He never gave up on anything, and he continued to hound and persuade, and I think he said all the right things because he was a scholar of that subject matter.
Once he finally gained Brickhill's approval, Sturges still faced the difficult task of persuading a film studio to take on the project. During the 1950s, John Sturges was under contract to MGM and had pitched the idea to Louis B. Mayer. Mayer rejected the story as too complicated and too expensive. But in 1960, the director scored a huge success with The Magnificent Seven. He now had the leverage he needed to convince the Mirisch Company and United Artists to produce the film. The real escape operation had involved hundreds of men. Sturges wanted to distill their stories into fewer characters, but still remain true to the story.
I think there's always a concern to make a picture as accurate as you can and then have some creative license to adjust to make it entertainment. And I think we held to this very closely. Maybe in some cases, characters were altered a little bit.
In 1962, Steve McQueen, James Garner, James Coburn, and Charles Bronson were among the first actors signed to the movie, all portraying characters based on a combination of real people.
Most of those characters, for example, James Gardner as the Scrounger, those roles were performed by a very large number of people.
But while most characters were composites of real people, one role did stand out, that of Roger Bartlett. Bartlett was based on Roger Bushell, a 33-year-old South African pilot who had played a unique role in devising the master escape plan.
Roger Bushell was a very impressive person. He was a hard man and a very just man, and a great admiration for him.
Determined to fill this key role authentically, the director chose British actor Richard Attenborough.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
As the rest of the cast came together, the script was completed by W.R. Burnett, an American screenwriter best known for writing gritty novels like The Asphalt Jungle. Sturges then brought on Australian-born writer James Clavell in the hope that he would ensure that the British characters were realistically created. The next step was to find a suitable location where the filmmakers could reconstruct the infamous prison camp.
The image of that Stalag was, besides the wire and the fences, there was this enormous forest. How would you get through that if you did get out? So I found 6 very crummy, scrawny pine trees, 6, between Idlewild and Palm Springs. And I said, John, I found the Black Forest. Just come and look at this. And he was fighting laughter and everything else as we looked at these terrible 6 trees. He said, no, this'll be fine. So the plan was we would build the camp around these 6 trees and call it the Black Forest.
A problem developed when the Screen Extras Guild prohibited the production from using local people as extras. Faced with the expense of bringing hundreds of extras more than 100 miles from Los Angeles every day, Assistant Director Bob Relia was dispatched to Europe to look for alternative locations.
I called John and said, I got some bad news for you. Guess what Germany looks like? It looks like Germany. It's criminal if we don't make the whole thing right here. It's crazy. It looks like Germany. And then we both swallowed hard and decided to go there.
The production was to be based at the Bavaria Studios outside Munich. Since the studios were surrounded by pine trees, the camp could be recreated right beside the sound stages. Conscious of Brickhill's concerns about accuracy, Sturges wanted his help on the design and layout of the camp.
He phoned Australia and asked Paul Brickhill to come, and Paul said, no, I've been sick, I can't possibly. He said, if you have any suggestions? He said, yes, I can tell you exactly who to take. Go to Canada and get Wally Floody. He built the thing. He'll know more about it than anybody else.
During captivity in Stalag Luft 3, Canadian airman Wally Floody had been responsible for the overall design and plan of the 3 escape tunnels. After the war, he had returned to his native country.
Floody had become an insurance executive in Canada. We made a deal with him to come over and spend 2 months with us, a month of preparation and the first month of shooting.
Wally sent for his logbook, and up behind Sturges on his desk, he had all the little authentic pictures of what Stalag Luft 3 that had come out of Wally's thing. Oh, yes, he wanted it to be authentic very much.
With Wally Floody on board as technical advisor, the filmmakers set about building the notorious prison camp. The real Stalag Luft 3 had caged 10,000 Allied airmen in 6 compounds. For the film, the producers built one compound and hired American students from the nearby university as extras.
The towers and the wires and structure and the huts and all that, it was exactly as it was. And the guards and the setup, that really struck me as being remarkable. They did a wonderful job of that.
In June 1962, the international cast and crew assembled in Bavaria, and cameras rolled on the recreation of one of the most famous escapes in military history.
Hey, did you see the cooler? Boy, is it ever a big one.
I think they expect a lot of business.
Yeah.
How far are the trees, Danny?
Over 200 feet.
Yeah, I'd say 300.
Long ways to dig.
We'll get Cavendish to make a survey. I wish Big X were here.
But the now legendary escape provided a unique challenge. The filmmakers had to make the audacious events they were depicting seem real to a film-going audience nearly 20 years after the true story had taken place.
Group Captain Ramsey, in the past 4 years, the Reich has been forced to spend an enormous amount of time, energy, manpower, and equipment hunting down escaping prisoner of war officers.
Well, at least it's rather nice to know you're wanted, isn't it?
For us, it's not a matter for levity. There will be no escapes from this camp.
During World War II, Allied airmen who were captured by the Germans were transported to one of several special prison camps for holding Air Force officers, far from the English Channel. Although the Geneva Convention protected prisoners of war from physical harm, the German forces wanted to make sure they couldn't rejoin the war effort.
There wasn't a damn thing you could do about it. As the Germans said to me when they took me into the farmhouse, "For you, the war is over."
The camps that housed Air Force officers were run by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe.
I guess you could call them the least Nazified of the German services. So there was a sense of camaraderie, you might say, or rapport for the flying officers.
But many of the Allied officers felt it was their duty to try to escape. And even if they didn't succeed, their efforts would tie up vital German manpower. The film quickly established this as the prisoner's strategy.
You appointed me Big X. And it's my duty to harass, confound, and confuse the enemy to the best of my ability.
That's true.
And that's what I intend to do. I'm going to cause such a terrible stink in this Third Reich of theirs that thousands of troops that could well be employed at the front will be tied up here looking after us.
How?
By putting more men out of this perfect camp of theirs than have ever escaped before. Oh, not blitzing out 2 or 3 or a dozen, but 200, 300, scatter them all over Germany.
We figured we were keeping quite a few Germans occupied, trying to keep us in. And we had a lot of minor escapes.
The object of the exercise wasn't really to get people home, because that very rarely happened. The object was to create disruption in occupied Europe and in Germany.
In April 1942, tired of the continual escape attempts that drained their resources, the Luftwaffe decided to move all the notorious escapers to one prison. The Luftwaffe expanded a small camp at Sagan, 100 miles southeast of Berlin, where they planned to operate an escape-proof compound. Captured airmen of all nationalities were brought together in the camp named Stalag Luft 3.
Well, they had taken everything they'd learned from 2.5 years of guarding prisoners of war and put it into that camp.
There was double barbed wire, fences 9 feet high, and coiled barbed wire in between. It was a very intimidating place, I must say. And they had lots of guards. There was guards in the towers. There was guards on the ground walking around the perimeter.
Despite the high security, as soon as the airmen were moved into the new compound, they tried to escape.
Danny and I have a blitz in mind. Could you put on some sort of brief show for the goons?
Their early attempts were random but persistent, as the screen version of the story chronicled.
So you had people crawling under trucks, jumping into trucks, trying to get out with parties of workmen. Exactly like it happened in the film.
Hold it, hold it!
But as the film also showed, the arrival of one man changed everything. Under the leadership of Roger Bushell, various escape activities became organized into one overall plan.
Bushell was a South African by birth who had come to England. He was extremely intelligent, very determined, immensely capable. He had great leadership skills. And very early in the war, although he wasn't the highest-ranking prisoner, he quickly emerged as the leader in terms of escaping.
Bushell's plan was to dig 3 tunnels at once. He reasoned that if one was found, they would still have 2 other chances of escape. But as the film accurately portrayed, the Luftwaffe had prepared the site for the compound very carefully in order to make life as difficult as possible for would-be escapees.
They had buried microphones around the perimeter wire so they could listen for the sounds of tunneling. They built the huts on stilts so the guards could get underneath and look for signs of tunneling.
The prisoners started 3 tunnels in separate huts. They nicknamed the tunnels Tom, Dick, and Harry, and each one had a unique trap door for access.
I think Dick's trap was the most ingenious, not only in this camp, but probably in any camp. It was constructed in the drain in the shower block, just like it shows in the film. The prisoners decided that they could bail out the water from the drain, sink their shaft through the side of the drain, and then seal it up again, fill it with water, and the Germans would never discover it was there. And in fact, they never did. It was the only tunnel that remained undiscovered through the whole war.
You're not in your hut? What are you doing here? Mopping up.
And you? Shower. I need a wash.
Each tunnel began with a shaft that was 30 feet deep. From this depth, the German guards wouldn't be able to hear the work that was going on right under their feet. Fortunately, the light soil was easy to excavate.
Well, it was mostly sand, damp sand, so you could use your hands. So we didn't have to use many implements at all.
But every 3.5 feet of tunnel produced nearly a ton of sand that had to be disposed of. On screen, the ingenious method of dispersal was authentically dramatized.
You fill these bags with the dirt from the tunnel. Then, wearing them inside your trousers, you wander out into the compound, where you pull these strings in your pockets. Out come the pin. Eric, it's good. All you have to do is kick it in.
I would go to the garden and I would pull the 2 strings in my pant pockets to release the sand. It would all dribble down there and pretty well below the surface. So that was one way of disposing of a great deal of sand, because there was an awful lot of people involved in getting rid of the sand.
But once the actual tunnels were under construction, the soft, sandy earth created another problem. The underground passageways were prone to cave-ins.
Sand has no support. You dig out, and it's just a matter of time till it'll collapse. Wally was digging, and I was passing back. And suddenly the candle blew out, and there was a hell of a wind in my face, so I knew damn well what it was. So I just went forward as fast as I could. And I got him out in about, well, I guess, minutes.
As the tunnels crept towards the perimeter of the compound, the prisoners used wooden bed slats to shore up the walls and built a railway to speed them through the dimly lit passage.
I thought the film did a wonderful job of giving viewers a real picture of what it looked like inside the tunnel. you would have a space that was probably 2.5 foot wide by 2 foot 8 inches high. It would be shored with lumber all the way along. There would be a little, essentially a trolley that would lie in your stomach to go back and forth.
The prisoners even invented an air supply system to improve conditions underground, which was faithfully reconstructed in the film with the help of technical advisor Wally Floody.
Is it finished?
Of course.
Why isn't it in?
Working on the air ducts now.
Well, when will they be finished?
1 or 2 days.
Does it work?
Of course it works.
Will it give us enough air?
Quite as much as you'll need.
The art department would take Wally and put him in the tunnel set, and he would literally say, you know, it's not tight enough because I remember my shoulders, I haven't gained that much weight, my shoulders were scraping, so they'd take him out and take him back the next day after they adjusted it.
With Floody's reassurance, Sturgis and his team were confident that they were realistically recreating the events of the daring escape.
Wally said, you know, you guys are getting it right, the wire and the construction and the actors. He said, I know you're getting it right. And I said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, because I'm having nightmares.
But as in real life, building the escape tunnel was only half of the story. And the Great Escape would soon come under fire for embellishing the role played by Americans in the breakout.
The general public would not know about the Americans not being in the escape. They could walk away from the movie with quite a wrong impression.
Now, in order to get the right amount of outfits, Roger, I suggest that we work mainly from service uniforms. Now, I can do double-breasteds, single-breasteds, and rather nice lounge suits.
In preparation for their flight to freedom, the prisoners of war in Stalag Luft 3 had to replace their officers' uniforms with clothes that would not reveal their true identity. As the film showed, the men were resourceful in using what few materials they had to create many different costumes.
Now, I've started working on the other materials. This blanket, particularly the striped, marvellous. Coats.
Yes?
I've got the chaps working on these all over the compound. Oh, those battle dresses, I'm afraid they're a bit too short. I'll have to get the chaps to make those into some sort of working man's outfits.
We had guys who were tailors in the camp. They were very good at it. For instance, some of the guys came in uniform, but the uniform they came in with, if you took a razor blade and sheared it very carefully, it would be the same color as a German uniform. And also they paraded themselves in uniform so we could copy them. So that was how we did it. And they were pretty good looking too.
The escapees would also need official documents and travel passes to allow them to pass through Germany to a neutral country such as Sweden or Switzerland. The prisoners' ingenuity in obtaining original papers to copy was also well documented in the film.
Oh, I'm sorry. Would you like one?
I'll smoke it later when I'm off duty, thank you.
Yeah, you probably have a couple of roommates, huh?
The method of bribery that was portrayed in the movie was absolutely right on the mark. The whole point was that the Americans had the benefit of Red Cross parcels and parcels from home that contained goods that the Germans didn't have access to, especially things like cigarettes and chocolate and coffee.
Why don't we go into my room where we can talk more comfortably, huh?
I'd better not. If Strachwitz should see me...
I was just going to make some coffee.
Dave, well, come and have a cup of coffee. Well, the Germans loved having real coffee, or a cigarette, or a piece of chocolate, or a bar of soap, you know. And then the demand, eventually a request would come, I wonder if you could bring us a copy of an Urlaubschein, the leave ticket that the Germans had to have if they went anywhere.
I must go. Oh, here, it's okay, look, keep it.
I'll never be able to eat it all. I've got all I could eat.
Ich muss jetzt hier raus.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right, forget it.
The escape organization included a team of men who meticulously crafted fake documents by hand.
Each of us had our specialities. My specialty was German script, the Gothic script, which sounds frightfully difficult, but in fact is awfully easy to forge.
They could copy any piece of paper you ever wanted to show them, and they were wonderful. We had Ausweises that were better than the Germans. I mean, it was terrific, and signed by Hitler and signed by whoever.
But many of the materials that were needed to manufacture documents, compasses, maps, and money were not available in the prison camp. The filmmakers made these resources seem easy to obtain and chose not to explain just how they were supplied. In fact, many items found their way into Stalag Luft 3, hidden inside parcels that were sent to the prisoners.
We had parcels from home. They called them personal parcels. But in there, sometimes you would find materials that were useful for escape.
Packages containing secret escape material were sent separately from the Red Cross and YMCA supplies in order not to compromise the work of the official organizations.
The role of the Red Cross and the YMCA was sacrosanct, and this should not be confused with the activities of both Washington and London to create many avenues for sending this material into the POWs, both through the families and through agencies.
The agencies responsible for these covert operations were MI9 in Britain and Ms. X in the United States. Military intelligence ran these undercover groups to assist the prisoners of war in their efforts to escape. But the systems used to aid the escapees were timeless. And even after the war, those involved felt that the information should remain classified.
When I did my original research, the prisoners pleaded with me not to reveal some of those techniques because they felt they were clever, but they were also basic and could be used in future wars. And so we honored that at that time.
By avoiding any mention of this confidential information, the plea for discretion on the part of the survivors was also respected by the filmmakers.
They were very sensitive to what was going on in Vietnam and elsewhere in the world and the plight of POWs, and I think there was just a general appreciation.
While support activities continued in the entire camp, the diggers kept working underground. On screen, the discovery of the tunnel called Tom led the team to concentrate on one of the remaining two in an effort to break out as soon as possible.
That's still going. Oh my God, they found Tom. Open up, Harry. We dig. Around the clock.
But in real life, it was news that the Germans planned to separate the American airmen from the British and Canadians that prompted the tunnelers to focus their efforts on just one tunnel.
They knew that the American prisoners were scheduled to leave the camp sometime in the fall of 1943, and they were very keen to break the tunnel before the Americans left so that they could have a chance to escape as well.
Unfortunately, the American officers were transferred to a new compound before the tunnel was completed. But the film's producers wanted to appeal to the widest audience possible. They also needed to showcase their cast of mostly American stars.
We felt at the time, United Artists felt, and so did the Mirishes, and John agreed that to go very accurate and have it all British, Australian, or Commonwealth people, that you would lose the potential market as compared to what you would have of making it an American or international, if you will, by throwing in a Steve McQueen, a Jim Garner.
Without haste. Forward, hard.
When the actual breakout took place in March 1944, no Americans escaped from the underground passage, although the film showed them playing a major role in the flight to freedom. The real prisoners understood the producer's decision and acknowledged the American airmen's enormous contribution to the overall escape effort.
After all, it was a movie, And the Americans did help a great deal.
Despite its overall attention to accuracy, The Great Escape had made compromises in both plot and characterization. But it was in the scenes which showed the escaped prisoners making their way to freedom that the producers faced their greatest challenge and their harshest criticism. The movie The Great Escape showed how, on the night of March 24th, 1944, the tunnel built by Allied prisoners of war in Stalag Luft 3 finally surfaced outside the perimeter fence. Although escape organizer Roger Bushell had hoped to lead 200 men to freedom, tunnel collapses and an unexpected air raid allowed fewer than half that number to get out before they were spotted by the German guards. This was vividly dramatized on screen.
Hey! Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot! Don't shoot!
79 actually got through the tunnel and out the other end. 3 of them were captured right at the tunnel mouth, and the other 76 got away and began their break.
The film charted the progress made by groups of prisoners, whether by catching the train, stealing a rowboat, or taking a bicycle. But the most spectacular getaway in the film was made by Hiltz, played by Steve McQueen.
The motorcycle sequence in The Great Escape was born out of a couple of things. One of them was Steve was very good on a motorcycle, so that's the solution to the problem. But what is the problem? Well, the problem is, what's he going to do in the chases? Because Lord knows we didn't have a scripted chase.
Hey! Wo willst du hin? Komm mal her!
We had nothing when we went out the morning with how do we get started with somebody chasing him? Well, a guy comes up and says, show me your papers. And he kicks him and takes off. That we just were winging it right there.
In fact, McQueen had only accepted the role on the condition that he could show off his motorcycle skills.
There was a good touch of Hollywood in it, of course. I mean, the Steve McQueen part and the motorbike, well, that was, strictly fiction.
The improvised scene culminated in Hilt's daring attempt to leap across the barbed wire barrier that stood between him and freedom in Switzerland.
No one was that adventurous. I thought that was a wonderful action scene. It has no reference to historical reality, but boy, it's a great scene. It's a great moment in the film.
In real life, most of the 76 Allied airmen were recaptured within days of their escape. But instead of being returned to Stalag Luft 3, they were held by the Gestapo while the German High Command decided their fate.
Hitler wanted all of them shot, out of hand. He wanted the entire lot of them executed immediately. He was apparently dissuaded by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who said killing all of them would do irreparable harm to our relations with the neutral nations. Someone then suggested, well, perhaps we should shoot half of them. And then they decided on 50, essentially as an arbitrary number.
All right, you can get out now. Stretch your legs for 5 minutes. It'll take hours before you reach the camp.
On screen, the killings were depicted as the mass murder of an entire group. The recaptured men, including Bartlett, were driven into the countryside where they were shot. Although the executions actually took place over several days, the film accurately portrayed the method.
They were taken out in ones and twos, small groups. The largest group, I think, was 10, typically to a field where they were allowed out to relieve themselves, and then shot in the back.
When the news reached the prison camp, those left behind were shocked to hear of the deaths of their comrades. It was obvious that the Gestapo had flagrantly broken the rules of the Geneva Convention.
Our officer asked, well, how many were wounded?
How many of the 50 were wounded?
And, well, of course, he was told none were wounded.
None.
And it was quite evident that they'd been murdered.
I see.
We were all called to roll call.
Edison, John?
And we were informed that 50 of them had been shot. Of the 76 that escaped, 50 of them had been killed by the Gestapo.
Everybody came away from that with a feeling of despair, and particularly in my case, because there were 4 of my very close friends were on that list.
I never spoke to a German again. We could cut them off completely. And they knew it. They knew they'd done something wrong.
Of the hundreds who had contributed to the escape operations in March 1944, only 3 men made it to freedom, just as the film showed.
I am your guide, senor.
Spain?
España.
Dutchman Bob Vanderstock traveled through Europe to Spain, while Norwegians Peter Bergslund and Jans Muir escaped on a ship from Stettin. But the murder of Roger Bushell and 49 of his fellow escapees cast a long shadow over the story. It posed a problem for the filmmakers, who needed to create a more upbeat ending to the picture.
A little bit of commerciality has to come into this, so I think that's extremely clear in the movie, that Bartlett and his fellows got it done. They died for it, but the tag on the end of the picture is that McQueen's character had survived, which made you feel pretty good because he wasn't with the main group.
Hey, Hilt!
When you see Steve McQueen back in the cooler bouncing his ball, it's like, oh, here's another day. It was never another day again. They were under a cloud thereafter that nobody could shake.
It's still not a feel-good picture. It never would be. Because you've got to do the execution at the end, or you're not only not being true to it, but I think you lose all the drama.
Only time would tell if the filmmakers had successfully balanced truth with drama, and in so doing, gained the respect of the men and women who fought and died in the war. The Great Escape burst onto movie screens in June 1963. Premiering in London, the filmmakers even arranged special screenings for the many ex-prisoners of war.
It probably was a better test for us than taking it to a public screening and doing our research screenings, because they all not only liked the picture, but said, no, that's it. You've accomplished it. If it had not sold any tickets, which there's always a chance of, that would have made it worthwhile anyway.
I can tell you overall the prisoners were delighted. They felt it captured the essence of what went on.
Well, he thought it was great. How could he not? It's a magnificent film. There's no question about that.
John Sturges felt very strongly that he had accomplished the nobility and the honor of it.
In July of that same year, premieres were held in New York and Los Angeles. The immediate critical and box office success of the film sealed Steve McQueen's fate as a major movie star. The composite characters that John Sturges had created were completely convincing, even to the people they were based on.
People who were in the camp have started to assimilate details of the movie into their own lives. And so you see people claiming, well, I was the inspiration for the James Garner character, or I was Steve McQueen, or I was James Coburn, or whatever. But it gives you a sense of how important the film has been in creating our perceptions of this event.
But even before the film made the story famous around the world, investigators in Europe tried to track down the murderers of the 50 slain airmen. In 1944, the British government had promised they would prosecute those responsible for the war crime.
They just doggedly kept looking at little pieces of evidence until they started finding the smoking gun, and broke really the code of saying the Zagan order was deliberate. It was from the highest levels. Eventually, they were able to find not only who received the order, but who was given the order to execute it, and they just pursued those to the end until finally they were convinced they had found virtually everybody who was, involved in that effort.
13 former Gestapo officers were convicted and hanged in Hamburg, Germany in 1948. The last assassin was found guilty and sentenced to prison 20 years later. But the 50 murdered airmen were always remembered by those who had decided not to take their chances in the tunnel.
If I had gone, I probably wouldn't be here now. I'd have missed a wonderful life. But then so did 50 others. I feel I've been the lucky one. Did I deserve to be the lucky one? I don't know.
I'm going to cause such a terrible stink in this Third Reich of theirs that thousands of troops that could well be employed at the front will be tied up here looking after us.
With its compelling blend of Hollywood polish and historical fact, The Great Escape helped to create a lasting tribute to the ingenuity and courage of the real-life men who never stopped fighting, even in captivity.
Unfortunately, you were shot down, so we are both grounded for the duration of the war.
Well, you speak for yourself, Colonel.
It is such an exciting movie. It's a great story on screen, and I think it's convinced a lot of people to go and look up the real history. It convinced me. It was the film that got me interested in pursuing this historical event.
The Great Escape had certain Hollywood flair, obviously, a little over the top, but you could understand why, for the drama.
In a day when we don't have many heroes, it's kind of nice to see some heroes resurface. And while there's a part of it that just instinctively says, yeah, but that's Hollywood, there's the other part of us that says, like I did, if even a fraction of that was true, and it was, then here's something to sit up and take notice and maybe find some inspiration.
To the colonies. Independent.